Section 14 of the Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer John Flint. Part 4, The Queen of Life. Chapter 1, Next Stop, Venus. When he first got the idea of the sky car, the doctor never stopped to consider whether he was the right man for such an excursion. Personally, he hated travel. He was merely a general practitioner with a great fondness for astronomy. The sole reason why he wanted to visit the planets was that he couldn't see them well enough with his telescope. So he dabbled a little in magnetism and so forth, and stumbled upon the principle of the cube. But he had no mechanical ability, and was on the point of giving up the scheme when he met Smith. He was instantly impressed by the engineer's highly commonplace face. He had had considerable experience with human contrariness, and felt sure that Smith must be an absolute wonder, since he looked so very ordinary. Kinney's diagnosis proved correct. Smith knew his business. The machinery was finished in a hurry and done right. However, when it came to fitting the outfit into a suitable sky car, Kinney was obliged to call in an architect. That accounts for E. William Jackson. At the same time, it occurred to the doctor that they would need a cook. Mrs. Kinney had refused to have anything whatever to do with the trip, and so Kinney put an ad in the paper. As luck could have it, Van Emmon, the geologist, who had learned how to cook when he first became a mountaineer, saw the ad and answered it in hope of adventure. The doctor himself, besides his training in the mental and bodily frailties of human beings, had also an unusual command of the related sciences, such as biology. Smith's specialties have already been named. He could drive an airplane or a nail with equal ease. Van Emmon, as a part of his profession, was a skilled fossilologist and was well up in natural history. As for E. William Jackson, the architect was also the sociologist of the four. Moreover, he had quite a reputation as an amateur antiquarian. Nevertheless, the most important thing about E. William Jackson was not learned until after the visit to Mercury, after the terrible end of that exploration, after the architect, falling in a faint, had been revived under the doctor's care. "Gentlemen," said Kinney, coming from the secluded nook among the dynamos, which had been the architect's bunk. "Gentlemen, I must inform you that Jackson is not what we thought. She is a woman." Which put an entirely new face upon matters. The three men, discussing it, marveled that the architect had been able to keep her sex a secret all the time they were exploring at Mercury. They did not know that none of E. William Jackson's fellow architects had ever guessed the truth. Ambitious and ingenious, with a natural liking for house planning, she had resolved that her sex should not stand in the way of success. And when she finally came to herself there in her bunk and suspected that her secret was out, instead of shame or embarrassment, she felt only chagrin. She walked rather unsteadily across the floor of the great cube-shaped car to the window where the three were standing, and as they quietly made a place for her, she took it entirely as a matter of course, and without a word. The doctor had been speaking of the peculiar fitness of the four for what they were doing. And if I'm not mistaken, he went on, we are going to need all the brains we can pull when we get to Venus. I never would have claimed when we started out that Mercury had ever been inhabited, but now that we've seen what we've seen, I feel dead sure that Venus once was peopled. The four looked down the triple-glass vacuum-insulated window at the steadily growing globe of Earth's twin sister, half in sunlight and half in shadow. This planet, for ages the synonym for beauty, was now but 1,000,000 miles away. She looked as large as the moon, but instead of a silvery gleam, she showed a creamy radiance, fully 3 times as bright. Let's see, reflected the geologist aloud. As I recall it, the brightness of a planet depends upon the amount of its air. That would indicate, then, that Venus has about as much as the Earth, wouldn't it? Remembering how the whole planet had looked when they left it. The doctor nodded. There are other factors, but undoubtedly we are approaching a world which is a great deal like our own. Venus is nearly as large as the Earth, has about 9/10 the surface, and the gravity almost as strong. The main difference is that she is only 2/3 as far from the sun as we are. How long is her day? Smith wanted to know. Can't say. Some observers claim to have seen her clearly enough to announce the day of the same length as ours. Others calculate that she is like Mercury, always the same phase 2 of the sun. If so, her day is also her year, 225 of our days. Van Emmon looked disappointed. In that case, she would be blistering hot on one side and freezing cold on the other, except, remembering Mercury, except for the twilight zone where the climate would be neither one nor the other, but temperate. He pointed to the line down the middle of the disk before them, the line which divided the lighted from the unlighted, the day from the night. The four looked more intently. It should be remembered that the very brilliance of Venus has always hindered the astronomers. The planet as a whole is always very conspicuous, but its very glare makes it impossible to see any details. The surface has always seemed to be covered by a veil of hazy, faintly trickered vapor. Smith gave a queer exclamation. For a moment or two, he stared hard at the planet, then looked up with an apologetic grin. I had a foolish idea. I thought, he checked himself. Say, doesn't Venus remind you of something? The doctor slowly shook his head. Can't say that it does, Smith. I have always considered Venus as having an appearance peculiarly her own. Why? The engineer started to answer, stopped, thought better of it, and instead pointed out the half that was in shadow. Why is it that we can make out the black portion so easily? Kinney could answer this. The fact is, it isn't really black at all, but faintly lighted. Presumably, it is starshine. Starshine? Echoed the architect, interested. Just that, you see, finished the doctor. If that side is never turned toward the sun, then it must be covered with ice. which would reflect the star. Ah, exclaimed Smith with satisfaction. I wasn't so crazy after all. My notion was that the whole blame thing is covered with ice. It looked reasonable. Certainly, the entire sphere had a somewhat watery appearance. It prompted the geologist to say, Kinney, if that reflection is really due to ice, then there must be plenty of water vapor in the air, and if that's the case, not only is life entirely possible, stated the doctor quietly, but I'll bet you this car against an abandoned soapstone mine that we find humans or near human beings there when we land tomorrow. End of section 14.
Section 15 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 2. Speaking of Venus. The architect was still dressed in the fashionably cut suit of men's clothes she had worn while in the car. Van Emmon thought of this when he said, somewhat awkwardly, "Well, I'm going to fix something to eat. It'll be ready in half an hour, Miss Jackson." She looked at him, slightly puzzled, then understood. "Do you mean to give me time to change my clothes?" "Thanks, but I'm used to these. And besides," with spirit, "I never could see why women couldn't wear what they choose so long as it is decent." There was no denying that hers were both becoming and decent. Modelled after the usual riding costume, both coat and breeches were youthfully rather than mannishly tailored, and the narrow vertical stripe of the dark gray material served to make her slenderness almost girlish. In short, with her poet-style hair, her independent manner and direct speech, she was far more like a boy of 20 than a woman nearing 30. She walked with Van Emmon, dodging machinery all the way, across the big car to the little kitchenette over which he had presided. There, to his dismay, the girl took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and announced her intention of helping. "You're a good cook, Van. I mean, Mr. "Let it go at Van, please," said he hastily. "My first name is Gustav, but nobody has ever used it since I was christened." "Same with my Edna," she declared. "Mother's name was Williams, and I was nicknamed Billy before I can remember. So that's settled," with great firmness. "The point is, Van, you're a good cook, but everything tastes of bacon. I wish you'd let me boss this meal." He looked rebellious for an instant, then gave a sigh of relief. "I'm really tickled to death." A little later the doctor and Smith, looking across, saw Van Emmon being initiated into the system which constructs scalloped potatoes. Next he was discovering that there is more than one way to prepare dried beef. "For once we won't cream it," said E. Billy Jackson dryly as Van Emmon laid down the can opener. "We'll make an omelet out of it and see if anything happens." She was already beating the eggs. He cut up the meat into small pieces, and when he was finished took the egg beater away from her. He turned it so energetically that a speck of foam flew into his face. "Go slow," she advised, nonchalantly reaching up with a dish towel and wiping the fleck away. Whereupon he worked the machine more furiously than ever. Soon he was wondering how on earth he had come to assume, all along, that she was not a woman. He now saw that what he had previously considered boyishness in her was in fact simply the vigor and freshness of an earnest, healthy, energetic girl. It dawned upon him that her keen gray eyes were not sharp but alert, her mouth not hard but resolute, her whole expression, instead of mannish, just as womanly as that of any girl who had been thrown upon her own resources and made good. He soon found that his eyesight did not suffer in any way because he looked at her. "Now," she remarked in her business-like way as she placed the brimming pan into the oven. "I suppose that I'll hear various hints to the effect that a woman has no business trying to do men's stunts. And I warn you right now that I am prepared to put up a warm argument." "Of course," said the geologist, with such gravity that the girl knew he didn't mean it. "Of course a woman's place is in the home, surrounded by 17 or 18 children, and cooking for that many more hired men besides. She is simply ideal. We realize that. Then, admitting that much, why shouldn't a woman be as independent as she likes? Think what women did during the war. Remember that a lot of women are doctors and lawyers. Is there any good reason why I couldn't design a library as well as a man could?" "None at all," agreed Van Emmon, handing over the dish of chopped meat. The girl carefully folded the contents into the now sponge-like omelet as he went on. "By the way, a neighbor of mine told me, just before I left, that he was having trouble with a broken sewer. How'd you like to "About as well as you'd like to darn socks," she came back, evidently being primed for such comments. She took a look at the potatoes, and then permitted the geologist to open their 6th can of peaches. "I must say they're good," she admitted, as she noted the eagerness with which he obeyed. Bread and butter, olives, coffee, and cake complemented that meal. The table was set with more care than usual, a clean cloth and napkins being unearthed for the occasion. When Smith and Kinney were called, both declared that they weren't hungry enough to do justice to it all. "It's just as well you weren't very hungry," commented Billy, as she finished giving each of them a second helping of the potatoes. "There's barely enough left for me." And she took it. "Say, I never thought of it before, Miss Billy," said Smith, coloring. "But you eat just as much as a man." "Ye gods, how shocking!" she jeered. "Come to think of it, Smith, you eat more than a woman." The doctor's face grew red with some suppressed emotion. After a while he said soberly, "I'll tell you what's worrying Smith. He's afraid that women, having suddenly become very progressive, will forge entirely ahead of men. You understand, having started, they can't stop. And I must admit that I've thought seriously of it at times myself." "Me too," added Van Emmon earnestly. "I have the same feeling about it that an elderly man must have when he sees a young one get on the job. Instead of being glad that the women are making good, I sort of resent it." "I knew it!" exclaimed the girl delightedly. "But I never heard a man admit it before." "Perhaps it isn't as serious as we think," said the practical Smith, scraping the bottom of the potato pan. "I believe that the progress of women may have a fine effect upon men, making us less self-satisfied and more alert. For one thing," glancing about the cube, "we've got to clean up a bit, now that we know you're a woman." The architect's eyes flashed. "Because you know mighty well I'll light in and do it myself if you don't, that's what you mean. Please take notice that I am to be respected, not because of what I am, but because of what I can do." "In behalf of myself and companions, I surrender," said the doctor gallantly. Then he instantly added, "And yet even when we are actually chivalrous, we are disregarding your desire to be appreciated for what you are worth. Pardon me, Miss Billy. I'll not forget again. At the same time, my dear," remembering that he had a daughter of his own, nearly the builder's age, "we men have come to think of women primarily as potential mothers and secondarily as people of affairs." "And considering that motherhood is something that is denied to us lords of the earth, for which we can thank a merciful Providence," interjected the girl solemnly. "Excuse my seriousness. Really amazing fact, you can't blame us for expecting women to fulfill this vital function before taking up other matters." "Yes?" remarked the girl, watching the peaches with an anxious eye as Van Emmon helped himself. "Funny, but I always understood that the first function of man was to father the race. Yet invariably the young fellows try to make names for themselves before, not after they marry." "Scout!" chuckled Van Emmon, as the doctor hid his discomfiture behind a large piece of cake. "You may know a lot about Venus, Doc, but you don't know much about women." "Speaking about Venus," Smith was reminded, We may learn something bearing upon the very point we have been discussing if Kin is right about the inhabitants." The doctor nodded eagerly. "You see, if there's people still alive on the planet, they're probably farther advanced than we on the earth. Other things being equal, of course. Being a smaller planet than ours, she cooled off sooner and thus became fit for life earlier, and having been made from the same batch, to use Van's expression, that Mercury and all the rest were, why, in all likelihood, evolution has taken place there much the same as with us, only sooner. I should expect," he elaborated largely, "that we shall find the inhabitants much the same as we humans, only extremely civilized. It may be that they are as far above us as we are above monkeys." Smith broke in by quoting an astronomer who contended that Venus kept only one face toward the sun. "Maybe she always did, Kinney." The doctor shook his head. "See how perfectly round she is. No oblateness whatever. It proves that she once revolved, otherwise she'd be pear shaped from the sun's pull." There was a short silence, during which Billy concluded that the only scraps left would be the coffee grounds. Then Van Emmon pushed away from the table, got to his feet, stretched a little to relieve his nerves, and said, "Well, whatever we find on Venus, I hope the women do the cooking." End of section 15.
Section 16 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 3. The First Venusian. When the sky car was within 1,000 miles of the surface, Smith adjusted the currents so that the floor was directed downward. The four changed from the window to the deadlight, and watched the approaching disk with every bit of the excitement and interest they had felt when nearing Mercury. The doctor had warned them that the heavy atmosphere which Venus was known to possess would prevent seeing as clearly as in the case of the smaller planet. All were much disappointed, however, to find that they were still unable to make out a single definite detail. The great half shining, half black world showed nothing but that vaguely streaked, ice like haze. There was something very queer about it all. "Strange that we should see no movement in those clouds," mused the doctor aloud. "That is, if they really are clouds." Van Emmon already doubted it. "Just what I was thinking. There ought to be terrific winds, yet so far as I have seen there's been nothing doing anywhere on the surface since we first began to observe it." After a while the doctor put away his binoculars and rubbed his eyes. "We might as well descend faster, Smith. Can't see a thing from here." Unhindered by air to impede its progress, the sky car had been hurtling through space at cometary speed. Now, however, Smith added the power of the apparatus to the pull of the planet, so that the disc began to rush toward them at a truly alarming rate. After a few seconds of it, Billy found herself unconsciously moving to the side of the geologist. He looked down at her, understood, and flushed with pleasure. "There's no danger," he confidently assured her, with the result that, her courage fortified, the girl moved back to her place again. Van Emmon inwardly kicked himself. So deceptive was that peculiar fogginess, Smith throttled their descent as soon as they had reached the point where the planet's appearance changed from brown to flat. They were headed for the line which marked the boundary of the shadow. This gray twilight zone was 300 or 400 miles in width. On the right of it, to the east, the dazzling surface of that sunlit vapor contrasted sharply with the all but black mistiness of the starward side. Clearly the zone ought to be temperate enough. Down they sank. As they came nearer, a curious pinkish tint began to show beneath them. Shortly it became more noticeable. The doctor gave a sudden grunt of satisfaction, and Smith stopped the car. A minute later the doctor had taken a sample of the surrounding ether through his laboratory test vestibule, and shortly announced that they were now floating in air instead of space. "Good deal like ours back home, too," exultingly. "Pretty thin, of course." He made a short calculation, referring to the aneroid barometer which was mounted on the outer frame of a window, and said he judged that their altitude was about 5 miles. The descent continued, Smith using the utmost caution. The other three kept their eyes glued to the deadlight, and their mystification was only equalled by their uneasiness as that motionless, bleary gaze failed absolutely to show anything they had not seen 1,000 miles higher, not a single detail. "It reminds me," said the girl in a low voice, "of something I once saw from the top of a hill. It was the reflection of the sun from the surface of a pond, not clear water, but covered with—" "Good heavens!" interrupted Van Emmon, struck with the thought. "Can it be the whole planet is under water?" Beyond a doubt his guess was justified. There was an oily smoothness about that dazzling haze which made it remarkably like a lake of still and rather dirty water under a bright sun. But the doctor said no. "Any water I ever heard of would make clouds," said he, "and we know there's air enough to guarantee plenty of wind. Yet nothing seems to be in motion." He was frowning continually now. It was Billy who first declared that she saw the surface. "Stop!" she said to Smith evenly, and he instantly obeyed. All four gathered around the deadlight, and soon agreed that the peculiarly elusive skin of the planet was actually within sight. However, it was like deciding upon the distance of the moon, as easy to say that it were within an arm's reach as a long ways off. The doctor went to a window. There he could look out upon the sun, a painfully bright object much larger than it looks from the earth. It was just ascending, and half of it was below the horizon. A blinding streak of light was reflected from a point on the surface not far from the cube. Shading his eyes with his hand, the doctor could see that the mysterious crust was absolutely smooth. On the opposite side of the car, the horizon ended in a sunrise glow of a slightly greenish radiance. From that side the pinkish tint of the surface was quite pronounced. Before going any lower, the doctor, struck with an idea, declared: "We always want to remember that this car is perfectly soundproof. Suppose we open the outer door of the vestibule. I imagine we'll learn something peculiar." It was possible to open this door without touching the inner valves, using mechanism concealed within the walls. The moment it was done, the door faced the north. Pandemonium itself broke loose. A most terrific shrieking and howling came from the outside. It was wind, passing at a rate such as would make a hurricane seem a mere zephyr. The doctor closed the door so that they could think. "It's the draft," he concluded. "The draft from the sun warmed side to the cold side." As for Van Emmon, he was getting out a rope and a heavy leaden weight. On the rope he formed knots every 5 feet, about 20 of them, and after getting into one of the insulated, aluminum armored and oxygen helmeted suits with which they had explored Mercury, he locked himself on the other side of the inner vestibule door and proceeded to sound. To the amazement of all except Billy, bottom was reached in less than 20 feet. "I thought so," she said with satisfaction. But she was not at ease until Van Emmon had returned in safety from that booming, whistling turmoil. His first remark upon removing his helmet almost took them off their feet. "The point is," said he, throttling his excitement, "the point is, the rope was nearly jerked out of my hands. Understand what I mean? The surface is revolving." This upset every idea they had had. It never occurred to any of them that the planet could revolve at such speed that it would appear stationary. Smith went at once to the eastern window and watched closely, for fear some irregularity in that apparently perfect sphere might catch them unawares. They did not learn till later that Venus's day is a little less than 25 hours, and therefore, since they had approached her near the equator, the wind they had encountered was moving at nearly 900 miles per hour. Bit by bit, though, the cube answered to the wind pressure. Soon they noted the sun rising slowly, and by the time it was 2 hours high, the surface, which had been whizzing under them like some highly polished top, became entirely motionless. The cube had stopped. 1 minute later the car touched the level. Smith very slowly reduced the repelling current so that the immense weight of the cube was but gradually shifted to the unknown surface beneath. Ton after ton was added until— "Stop!" came from the doctor. He had noted through the window a slight curvature in the material. So the machinery was left in action. "At any rate," said Smith, "we know that the confounded stuff isn't anti-magnetic, whatever it is." Of course this was true. Even though the gelatin-like shell could not support the cube's weight, yet it did not insulate the planet from the repelling current. The thermometer registered 335° Fahrenheit, 280° higher than it would be at home in the same latitude, remarked the doctor. We'll have to use the suits. He took it for granted that exploration should begin at once. No one stayed behind. The machines could be relied upon, as they knew from nearly 2 weeks of use, and certainly there was nothing in sight which could possibly interfere with the cube. Nevertheless, the matter-of-fact engineer took care to remove part of the door operating apparatus when he left the vestibule, and nobody commented upon it. It seemed the sensible thing to do, that was all. There was just about enough additional weight in their suits to balance the slightly reduced gravitation, so they moved about, four misshapen metallic hulks, with as much freedom as though back home. Always they kept within a few feet of each other, so as to throw no strain on their interconnecting telephone wires. The big glass-faced helmets gave a remarkable sense of security. They made a complete circuit of the cube, and at the end of it looked at each other in perplexity. Never, save in the middle of an ocean, in the doldrums, did any man ever see such a totally barren spot. Not a tree, much less a sign of human occupation. There was not even the slightest mound. The planet was, in fact, as smooth and as bare as a billiard ball. Moreover, the surface itself remained as mysterious as before. Of course they did not touch it with bare hands. All wore insulated mittens, but the dazzling stuff was certainly as hard as steel and as highly polished. It was neither transparent nor opaque, but translucent, like pink mother of pearl, as Billy suggested. She was first to propose that they move to another spot. "We ought to try a place where it's not yet dawn," said she, shielding her eyes from the glare. It will be remembered that the suits protected them from the heat itself. "Can't see anything." "Hush!" hissed the doctor. They turned and followed his gaze to a spot not 30 feet from where they stood. At the same instant they felt a faint jar in the material under their feet, and next second they saw that a large section of the supposedly solid surface was in motion. A portion about 10 feet square was being lifted bodily in front of their eyes, and before another word was said this block of the unknown substance was raised until they could see that it was all of a yard thick. Up it went at the same deliberate rate, and the four involuntarily moved closer together as they saw that there was something underneath. It was a cage, for all the world like that of an elevator, except that it was made of clear glass. Another second and it had stopped, with its floor level with the surface, and the people from the earth saw that it contained a man. He was quite tall, slenderly built, and dressed in a queer satiny material which fitted him like an acrobat's suit. He was extremely thin as to legs, narrow as to shoulders, deep in the chest, and short in the waist. All this, however, they saw after their inspection of his head. It was human, marvellously refined in every detail, yet it was set upon a graceful neck, and modelled upon much the same lines as that of any man. It was not that of a brute, nor yet that of a bird. It was human. He stood at ease, resting slightly on one foot, and dispelled any notion that he might be unreal by shifting his weight occasionally. Meanwhile he watched the four with a grave, interested smile, and they in turn came closer. His chin was small, even retreating, but his mouth was wide and curved into an exaggerated Cupid's bow. Even as he continued to smile, the curves did not leave his lips. They, however, went thin rather than thick. His nose was quite small, with a decidedly Irish cast, but his eyes, set far apart above the quite shallow cheekbones, were exceedingly large and of a brilliant blue. In fact, it was mainly his eyes that gave character to his face, although none could overlook his breadth of forehead, running back to a cranium that fairly bulged over the ears and seemed ready to rise like a tightly inflated balloon. His skin was pure white. And so they stood for uncounted minutes. At last the doctor noted that the stranger was eyeing them with far less interest than they showed in him. He stood as though he felt on display, and the doctor gave an exclamation of perplexity that broke the spell. The four impulsively drew up to the glass. Van Emmon touched it with his mitten, and that is how the four explorers came to receive the vibrations that came next. For the man in the cage, in turn, put out his hand and touched the glass opposite Van Emmon. Then he opened his mouth. "I am very glad to see you," said he in a soft, pulsating voice, and in the best of English. End of section 16. Section 17 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 4. A Puzzled World. For a moment blank amazement gripped the four. Then amazement gave way to genuine apprehension. Were they insane to imagine that this man of another world had spoken to them in their own language? Each looked at the other and was astounded to see that all had heard the same thing. Presently the stranger spoke again. If anything, the kindly smile on his face became even broader. "Suppose we postpone explaining how I am able to use your tongue. It will be easier for you to understand after you have been with us a while." He spoke slowly and carefully, yet with a faint lisp, much as some infant prodigy might speak. But there was no doubt that he had really done it. The doctor managed to clear his throat. "You are right," said he, with vastly less assurance than the amazing stranger. "We will try to understand things in the order you think best to present them. You should know best." Kinney introduced himself by name and profession, also the other three. The stranger nodded affably to each. "You may call me Estra," said he, pronouncing it Ethtra. "There is no occupation on the earth corresponding with mine, but in my spare moments I am an astronomer like yourself." The doctor silently marveled. He had not told the stranger about his hobby. Meanwhile the architect attempted to break the ice even finer. "We take it for granted," said she, rather nervously, "that your people are somewhat further advanced than us on the earth. However, we expect to be given credit for having visited your planet before you visited ours." She said this with an engaging smile which won an instant response. The Venusian's lips almost lost their curves in his generous effort. "You will find that we greatly respect all that you have accomplished," he declared earnestly. "As for your apparatus," glancing at the cube, "you have the advantage on the earth of certain chemical elements which are entirely lacking here. Otherwise we should have called upon you long ago." He slipped a panel of glass to one side. "Step in quickly," he exclaimed, gasping, and the four obeyed him without thought. It was only when the panel was replaced that they noticed the floor of the cage. It was of clear glass, like the sides, and looked totally incapable of bearing their combined weight. The Venusian smiled at Smith's worried look. "The material is amply strong enough," said he. "I am only concerned about your machine there. Is it safe to be left alone?" "So far as we know, yes," answered Van Emmon, who did not feel quite as much confidence in the stranger as the rest. "Then we can go down at once." With these words the man in satin turned to a small black box in one wall of the elevator and touched a button. [Footnote: For details of this and other matters of an electrical and mechanical nature, the technical reader is referred to Mr. Smith's Reports to the A.S.M.E. Instantly the car began to descend, at first slowly, and then with swiftly increasing velocity. By the time the explorers had accustomed their eyes to the sudden semi-darkness, the cage was dropping at such a speed that the air fairly sang past its sides. Far overhead was a square, black shadow in the wax-like crust which they had left. It was the shadow of the cube. All about them was a dimly lit network of braces, arches, and semi-transparent columns. To all appearances the system seemed to support the crust. Billy whirled upon the Venusian. "I've got it now. The whole globe is covered with glass." Estra smiled his approval. "For thousands upon thousands of centuries, my friend, the thing was done when our ancestors first suspected that our planet was doomed to come so near the sun. It was the only way we could protect ourselves from the heat." Great! Exploded the doctor, admiration overcoming regret that he had not thought of it himself. But Smith had other thoughts. How long did it take you to finish the job, and what did it cost? 2 centuries, and about twice the cost of your last war. I need only suggest to you that we colored the material so as to reflect most of the heat. That is why the material looks blue from below, although pink from above. Say, from Billy, how long are we to keep on dropping like this? We will arrive in a moment or two, answered the smiling one. The roof is raised several miles above the sea level in order to cover all the mountains. By this time the four were able to make out things pretty well. They saw that the dimness was only relative. The Venusian world was actually as well lighted as any part of the earth on a cloudy day, and they saw that they were descending in a locality of astonishing beauty. The stranger halted the car so that they could inspect the scene as though from an airplane. In no way did the landscape resemble that of the earth. To begin with, pillars of huge dimensions were placed every quarter mile or so. It was these that supported the intricate archwork above. They were made of the same translucent stuff as the crust, but had a light topaz tint. The Venusian said, "You will not need to be told that the science of metallurgy has advanced quite far with us. All our metals can be made transparent, if we like. Those pillars are colored variously in different regions so as to be clearly distinguishable and prevent collisions of flying apparatus." But Van Emmon and Billy were both more interested in what lay between the columns. They scarcely noticed that there were no people in sight at the time. The ground was covered with an indescribable wealth of color, and it was only by a close examination that the buildings could be distinguished as such. For they were all made of that semi-transparent stuff, of every conceivable tint and shade. The structure showed an utter lack of uniformity in size, shape, or arrangement. Moreover, the ground was absolutely packed with them. They spread as far as the eye could reach. But if there was a profusion, there also was confusion, apparently. Streets ran anywhere and everywhere. There was no visible system to anything. And where there was no space for a building, invariably there was a shrub, a bush, or a small tree of some kind, all in full flower. The only sign of regularity to be seen was in the roofs. Practically all of them were flat. Whether the building was some rambling, loosely gathered agglomeration of vari-colored wings, or a single towering skyscraper of one tint, almost inevitably it was crowned with a perfectly level surface. "I see," said Van Emmon thoughtfully. "You have no rain." "Precisely," from Estra. "We have the air completely under our control. We give our vegetation artificial showers when we think it should have it, not when nature wills. And similarly, we use electricity instead of sunlight, that we may stimulate its growth. In short," Van Emmon put it as the car slid slowly down the remaining distance, "in short, you have abolished the weather." The Venusian nodded. "And I'll save you the trouble of suggesting," he added, "that we are nothing more nor less than hothouse people." End of chapter 4. Recording by Amy Graymore. www.amysmindtoyourmind.com.
Section 18 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Agnew. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 5. The Human Conservatory. "But there is a difference," he cautioned as he stepped out of the elevator into a sort of plaza. "That whereas you people on Earth have only begun to use the hothouse principle, we here have perfected it. I suggest that you waste no time looking for faults." Van Emmon stared at the doctor. How does this idea fit your theory, Kinney? That Venus is simply the Earth plus several thousand extra generations of civilization? Fit? Echoed the doctor. Fits like a glove. We humans are fast becoming a race of indoor people, despite all the various back-to-nature movements. Look at the popularity of enclosed automobiles, for example. The only thing that surprises me, turning to their guide, is that you use your legs for their original purpose. Estra smiled and pointed out something standing a few feet away. It was a small, shuttle-shaped aircraft, with clear glass sides, which had actually made them overlook it at first. Peering closer, they saw that the plaza and surrounding streets were nearly filled with these all but invisible cars. The Venusian explained, "You marvel that I use my legs and walk the same as you do. I'm glad you have brought up this point, because it is a fact that our people use mechanisms instead of bodily energy almost altogether. These cars you see are universally used for transportation. I'm one of the very few who appreciate the value of natural exercise." "Do you mean to say," demanded Van Emmon, "that the average Venusian does no walking?" "Not a mile a year," said Estra gravely. "Just what he is obliged to do indoors from room to room." And he involuntarily glanced down at his own extremely thin legs. The architect's eyes widened with growing understanding. "I see now," she murmured. "That's why there was no one else to greet us." The Venusian smiled gratefully. "We thought it best. You have been shocked outright. I'm sure you have been introduced to a representative Venusian without any explanation." They fell silent. Still, without moving from the point where they had left the elevator, the four from Earth examined the surrounding buildings in a renewed effort to see some system in their arrangement. Directly in front of them was a particularly large structure. Like all the rest, it was of hopelessly irregular design, yet it had a large domed central portion which gave it the appearance of an auditorium, and the effect was further borne out by the subdued humming sound which seemed to come from it. Smith asked Estra if it were a hall. "Yes and no," was the answer. "It fills the purpose of a hall, but is not built on the hall plan." And Smith tried to stare through the translucent walls of the thing. The other buildings within immediate reach were of every possible appearance. Some would have passed for cottages, others for stores, still others for the most fanciful of studios. And nowhere was there such a thing as a sign, even at the street corners, much less on a building. "Not that we would be able to read your signs if you had them," commented the doctor. "But I'd like to know how your people find their way without something of a kind to guide them." Estra's smile did not change. "That is something you will understand better before long," said he, "providing you feel ready to explore a little further." The four looked at each other in question, and suddenly it struck them all that they were rather a pugnacious-looking crew in their cumbersome suits of armor and formidable helmets. The doctor turned to Estra. "You ought to know," he appealed, "whether we can take off these suits now." "It would be best," was the reply. "You will find the air and temperature decidedly more warm and moist than you would have been used to, but otherwise practically the same. There is a slightly larger proportion of oxygen, that is all. Just imagine you are in a hothouse." Smith and the doctor were already discarding their suits. Von Emmon and Billy followed more slowly, the one because he did not share the doctor's confidence in their guide, the other because of a sudden shyness in his presence. The Venusian noted this. "You need not feel any embarrassment," said he to Billy's vast astonishment. "There is no distinction here between the dress of the two sexes." And again all four marveled that he should know so much about them. Once out of the armor, the visitors felt much more at ease. The slightly reduced gravitation gave them a sense of lightness and freedom which more than balanced the jungle-like oppressiveness of the air. They found themselves guarding against a certain exuberance. Perhaps it was the extra oxygen, too. They strode toward the large structure directly ahead. At its entrance, a wide square portal which opened into a fan-shaped lobby. Estra paused and smiled apologetically, as he mopped his forehead and upper lip with a paper handkerchief, which he immediately dropped into a small, trap-covered opening in the wall at his side. These little doors, by the way, were to be seen at frequent intervals wherever they went. Incidentally, not a scrap of paper or other refuse was to be noted anywhere. Streets and all were spotless. As for Estra, "I am not accustomed to moving at such speed," he explained his discomfort. "If you do not mind, please walk a little more leisurely." They took their time about passing through this lobby. For one thing, Estra said there would have been a small delay, and for another, the walls and ceiling of the space were most remarkably ornamented. They were fairly covered with what appeared, at first glance, to be absolutely lifelike paintings and sculptures. They were so arranged as to strengthen the structural lines of the place, and, of course, they were of more interest to Billy than the others. Footnote: the specialist in architecture and related subjects is referred to E. Williams Jackson's report to the AIA for details of these bas-relief photographs. End of footnote. Desiring to examine some of the work far overhead, Billy clambered up on a convenient pedestal in order to look more closely. She took the strength of things for granted, and put her weight too heavily on the molding on the edge of the pedestal, with the result that there was a sharp crack, and the girl struck the floor in a heap. She got to her feet before Van Emmon could reach her side, but her face was white with pain. "Sprained ankle," she said between set lips, and proceeded to stump up and down the lobby. "To limber up," she said, although her three companions offered to do anything that might relieve her. To the surprise of all, Estra leaned against a pillar and watched the whole affair with perfect composure. He made no offer of help, said nothing whatever in sympathy. In a moment he noticed the looks they gave him, their stares. "I must beg your pardon," he said, still smiling. "I am sorry this happened. It will not be easy to explain. But you will find all Venusians very unsympathetic. Not that they are hard-hearted, but because we simply lost the power of sympathy. We do not know what pity is. We have eliminated everything that is disagreeable, all that is painful, from our lives to such an extent that there is never any cause for pity." The three young people could say nothing in answer. The doctor, however, spoke thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is superfluous. But tell me, have you done away with injustice, Estra?" "That is just the point," agreed the Venusian. "Justice took the place of pity and mercy. It was so long ago I am barely able to appreciate your own views on the subject." Billy, her ankle somewhat better, turned to examine other work. But at the moment another Venusian approached from the upper end of the lobby. Walking slowly, he carried 4 small parcels with a great deal of effort, and the explorers had time to scrutinize him closely. He was built much like Estra, but shorter, and with a little more flesh about the torso. His forehead bulged directly over his eyes, instead of above his ears, as did Estra's. Also his eyes were smaller, but not as far apart. His whole expression was equally kind and affable, despite a curiously shriveled appearance of his lips. They made the front of his mouth quite flat, and served to take attention away from his pitifully thin legs. Estra greeted him with a cheery phrase, in a language decidedly different from any the explorers were familiar with. In a way it was Spanish, or rather the pure Castilian tongue, but it seemed to be devoid of the dental consonants, and was very agreeable to listen to. Esther, however, had taken the 4 parcels from his comrade, and now presented him to the 4, saying that his name was Calara, and that he was a machinist. "He cannot use your tongue," said the Venusian. "Few of us have mastered it. There are difficulties. As for these machines," unwrapping the parcels, "I must apologize in advance for certain defects in their design. I invented them under pressure, so to speak, having to perfect the whole idea in the rather short time that has elapsed since you, Doctor, began the sky car." "And what is the purpose of the machines?" from Billy, as she was about to accept the first of the devices from the Venusian. For some reason he appeared to be especially interested in the girl, and addressed half of his remarks to her, and it was while his smiling gaze was fixed upon her eyes that he gave the answer. "They are to serve," very carefully, "partly as lexicons and partly as grammars. In short, they are mechanical interpreters." End of section 18. Read by Mary Agnew.
Section 19 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 6. The Translating Machines. "First, let me remind you," said the Venusian, "of our lack of certain elements that you are familiar with on the earth. We have never been able to improve on the common telephone. That is why we must still assemble in person whenever we have any collective activity. While on the earth, the time will come when your wireless principle will be developed to the point of transmitting both light and sound, and after that there will be little need of gatherings of any sort." Then he explained the apparatus. It consisted of a miniature head telephone, connected to a small metallic case the size of a cigar box, the cover of which was a transparent diaphragm. Estra did not open the case, but showed the mechanism through the cover. "Essentially, this is a word-for-word device," said he, pointing to a swiftly revolving dial within the box. "On one face of that dial are some 10,000 word images, made by vibration after the phonograph method. Directly opposite, on the other face, are the corresponding words in the other language. The disc is rotating at such an enormous speed that, for all practical purposes, any word which may chance to be spoken will be translated almost instantaneously." He indicated 2 delicate, many-tentacled feelers, as he called them, one on each face of the disc. One of these "felt" the proper word image as it whirled beneath, while the other established an electrical contact with the corresponding waves beneath, at the same time exciting a complicated-looking talking machine. "That," commented Estra, "is not so easy to explain. It transformed this literal translation into an idiomatic one. Perhaps you will understand its workings a little later when you learn how and why I am able to use your own language." By this time the 4 had reached the point where nothing could surprise them. They were becoming accustomed to the unaccustomed. Had they been told that the Venusians had abolished speech altogether, they would have felt disappointed, but not incredulous. However, the doctor thought of something. "Have you any extra records to be used in case we visit some other nations while we are here?" For just a second the Venusian was puzzled. Then his smile broadened. "The one record will do," said he, "wherever you go." "A universal language!" Billy's eyes sparkled with interest. "Long, long ago," Estra said, "it was established, soon after our League of Nations was formed." "Does the League actually prevent war and promote peace?" demanded Van Emmon. This has been a disputed question when the 4 left the earth. "We no longer have a League of Nations," said their guide slowly. and instantly the four were eyeing him eagerly. This was really refreshing, to find that the Venusians were actually lacking in something. "So it didn't work," commented the doctor, disappointed. But the Venusian's smile was still there. "It worked itself out," said he. "We have no further use for a league. We have no more nations. We are now one." And he helped them adjust the machines. The cases were slung on their shoulders, and the telephones clamped to their ears. When all ready, Esdras began to talk, and his voice came nearly as sharp and clear through the apparatus as before. It was modified by a metallic flatness, together with a certain amount of mechanical noise, in which a peculiar hissing was the most noticeable. Otherwise he said: "I am now using my own language. If I make any mistakes, you must not blame the machine. It is as nearly perfect as I was able to make it." He then asked them what blunders they noted. Billy, who was the most enthusiastic about the thing, declared that they would have no trouble in understanding. Whereupon Esdras quietly asked: "Do you feel like going now to try them out?" Once more an exchange of glances between the four from the earth. Clearly the Venusians were extremely considerate people, to leave their visitors in the care of the one man, apparently, who was able to make them feel at home. There seemed to be no reason for uneasiness. But Van Emmon still had his old misgivings about Esdras. There was something about the effeminate Venusian which irritated the big geologist. It always does make a strong man suspicious to see a weaker one show such self-confidence. Van Emmon drew the doctor and Billy aside, while Smith and Esdras went on with the test. Said Van Emmon: "It just occurred to me that the cube might look pretty good to these people. You remember what this chap said about their lack of some of our chemicals? What do you think? Is it really safe to put ourselves entirely in their power?" "You mean," said the doctor slowly, "that they might try to keep us here rather than lose the cube?" Van Emmon nodded gravely, but Billy had strong objections. "Esdras doesn't look like that sort," she declared vehemently. "He's too good-natured to be a crook. He needs a guardian rather than a warden." It flashed into the doctor's mind that many a woman had fallen in love with a man merely because he seemed to be in need of someone to take care of him. That is, the self-reliant kind of woman. And Billy certainly was self-reliant. Something of the same notion came vaguely to the geologist at the same time, and with a vigour that was quite uncalled for he urged: "I say safety first. We shouldn't have left the cube unguarded. I propose that one of us, at least, return to the surface while the others attend this meeting. Or trap, for all we know." "All right," said Billy promptly. "Get Esdras to show you how to use the elevator, and wait for us in the vestibule." Van Emmon's face flamed. "That isn't what I meant," hotly. "If anybody goes to the cube, it should be you, Billy." If Billy did not notice the use of a nickname, at least the doctor did. The girl simply snorted. "If you think for 1 second that I'm going to back out just because I'm a woman, let me tell you that you're very badly mistaken." Van Emmon turned to the doctor appealingly, but the doctor took the action personally. He shook his head. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, Van. Esdras looks safe to me. Go and ask Smith. Maybe he's willing to be the goat." The geologist took one good look at the engineer's absorbed, unquestioning manner as he listened to the Venusian, and gave up the idea with a sigh. For a moment he was sour. Then he smiled shyly. "I'm more than anxious to meet the bunch myself," he admitted, and led the walk back to Esdras. The Venusian looked at him with no change of expression, although there was something very disconcerting in the precocious wisdom of his eyes. Their very kindliness and serenity gave him an appearance of superiority such as only aggravated the geologist's suspicions. But there was nothing to do but to trust him. They followed him through 2 sets of doors, which slid noiselessly open before them in response to some mechanism operated by the Venusian's steps. This brought them to another of the glass elevators, in which they descended perhaps 10 feet, stepping out of it onto a moving platform. This, in turn, extended the length of a low dimly lighted passageway about 100 yards long. When they got off, they were standing in a small ante-room. The Venusian paused and smiled at the four again. "Do you feel like going on display now?" he asked, and added, "I should have said, do you feel like seeing Venus on display, for we all know more or less about you already." But the visitors were braced for the experience. Estra looked at each approvingly, and then did something which made them wonder. He stood stock still for perhaps a second, his eyes closed as though listening, and then, without explanation, he led the way through an opal glass door into a brilliantly lighted space. Next moment the explorers were standing in the midst of the people of Venus. End of section 19. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway, the 18th of February 2012. Section 20 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Race. The four were at the bottom of a huge cone-like pit, such as instantly reminded the doctor of a medical clinic. The space where they stood was, perhaps, 20 feet in diameter, while the walls enclosing the whole hall were many hundreds of feet apart, and sloping up from the center on all sides was tier upon tier of the most extraordinary seats in all creation. For each and every one of those thousands of Venusians was separately enclosed in glass. Nowhere was there a figure to be seen who was not installed in one of those small transparent boxes, just large enough for a single person. Moreover, and it came somewhat as a shock to the four when they noted it, the central platform itself was both covered and surrounded with the same material. "Make yourself at home," Estra was saying. He pointed to several microphones within easy reach. "These are provided with translators, so when you are ready to open up conversation, go right ahead as though you were among your own people." And he made himself comfortable in a saddle-like chair, as much as to say that there was no hurry. For a long time the explorers stood taking it in. The Venusians, without exception, stared back at them with nearly equal curiosity. And despite the extraordinary nature of the proceeding, this mutual scrutiny took place in comparative silence. For while the glass gave a certain sense of security to the newcomers, it also cut off all sound except that low humming. The nearest row of the people got their closest attention. Without exception, they had the same general build as Estra, slim, delicate, and anemic. They resembled a ward full of convalescent consumptives, as the doctor commented under his breath. Not one of them would ever give a joke-smith material for a fat man anecdote. At the same time, there was nothing feverish, nervous, or broken down in their appearance. "A pretty lot of invalids," as Billy added to the doctor's remark. Many observers would have been struck, first, by the extreme diversity in the matter of dress. All wore skin-tight clothing, and much of it was silky, like Estra's. But there was a bewildering assortment of colors, and the most extraordinary decorations, or, rather, ornaments. So far as dress went, there was no telling anything whatever about sex. "Are they all men?" asked Billy, wondering, of Estra. The Venusian shook his head with his invariable smile. "Nor all women either," said he enigmatically. But in many respects they were astonishingly alike. Almost to a soul their upper lips were withered and flat. One and all had short, emaciated-looking legs, Each and every one had a crop of really luxuriant hair. The shades varied between the usual blonde and brunette, with little of the reddishness so common on earth, but there were no bald people at all. On the other hand, there were no beards or moustaches in the whole crowd. Every face was bare. "Like a lot of Chinamen," said Van Emmon in an undertone. "Can't tell one from another." But Billy pointed out that this was not strictly true. A close inspection of the faces showed an extremely wide range of distinction. No two chins in the crowd were exactly alike, although not one of them showed any of the resolute firmness which is admired on earth. All were weak, yet different. Neither were there any prominent noses, although there were none that could have been called insignificant. And while every pair of eyes in the place was large as Estra's, yet there was every desirable color and expression. To sum it all up, and to use the doctor's words, "They've developed a standard type all right, just as the characteristic American face is the standard Earth type, but did you ever see such variations?" Nevertheless, the most striking thing about these people to the eyes of the visitors was their mutual resemblance. For one thing, there seemed to be no nervous people present. There were many children in the crowd, too, yet all sat very still, and only an occasional movement of the hands served to indicate consciousness. In this sense, they were all remarkably well bred. In another, they were remarkably rude. At any given moment a good half of the people were eating, or, rather, sipping liquids of various sorts from small tumblers. Probably every person in the house, before the affair was over, had imbibed 2 or 3 ounces of fluid, but not once was the matter apologized for, nor the 4 invited to partake. "So this may be the outcome of our outrageous habit of eating sweetmeats at theatres," muttered the doctor, and again noting the hairless faces. "Just what I said when men first began using those depilatories instead of shaving. No more beards." But it was Billy who explained the invariable crop of hair. "No use to look for baldness. They don't wear hats. Why should they, since there's neither sun nor rain to protect their heads from?" Mainly, however, the architect was interested in the building itself. To her, the most striking feature was not the tremendously arched dome, nor yet the remarkable system of bracing which dispensed with any columns in all the vast space. It was something simpler. There were no aisles. "Now what do you make of that?" the girl asked Van Emmon. "How do they ever get to their places?" But he could not suggest anything more than to recall an individual elevator scheme once proposed. To Smith, one object of interest was the telephone system. Remarkably like those used on the earth, one was located in each of the tiny glass cages. He was likewise puzzled to account for the ventilation system. Each cage was apparently airtight, yet no Venusian showed any discomfort. But the geologist, for want of anything strictly within his professional range, interested himself in trying to fathom the moral attitude of these people. He was still suspicious of them, notwithstanding a growing tendency to like every one of their pleasant, really agreeable faces. There was neither solemnity, sourness, nor bitterness to be seen anywhere. At the same time there was no sign of levity. In every countenance was the same inexplicable mixture of wisdom and benevolence that distinguished Estra. Nowhere was there hostility, and nowhere was there crudity. Somehow, the big geologist would have felt more at home had he seen something antagonistic. Essentially, Van Emmon was a fighter. At last the 4 felt their attention lagging. Novelties always pall quickly, no matter how striking. Estra sensed the feeling and inquired, "Which of you will do the honors?" Instinctively, the 3 younger folk turned to the doctor. He made no protest, but stepped at once to one of the microphones, put on his most impressive professional face, and began. "My friends," and Van Emmon noted a pleased look come into every face about them. "My friends, I do not need to state how significant this meeting is to us all. From what Esdras has said, I gather that you have informed yourself regarding us, in some manner which he has promised to make clear. At all events, I am exceedingly anxious to see your astronomical apparatus." At this, a broad smile came to many of the faces before him, but he went on, unnoticing. "Certainly, there is not much I could tell you, which you do not already know. Esdras' use of our language proves this. I only need to assure you that we will be glad to answer any questions that may occur to you. It goes without saying that we, of course, are filled with delight to find your planet so wondrously and happily populated, especially after our experience of Mercury, of which, I presume, you are informed." Apparently they were. The doctor went on. "You may be sure that we are fairly bursting with questions. However, we are content to become informed as Esdras sees fit to guide us. There is just one thing more than any other which I would like to know at this time. Why is it that, although you all show a great lack of exercise, and are continually eating, you never appear to be healthy?" Instantly, a Venusian in the fifth row, to the doctor's right, touched his phone and replied, "It is a matter of diet. We have nothing but absolute foods, if you understand what that means." And from that time on, despite the fact that the explorers asked questions which, at home, would have found hundreds ready and able to answer, on Venus only one person answered any given question, and always without any apparent prearrangement. For a long time they could not account for this. The doctor motioned for Smith to take his place. The engineer looked a little embarrassed, but cleared his throat nosily and said, "I am especially struck by the fact that each of you sits in a separate glass pew or case. Why is this?" The reply came from one of the few people present who showed any signs of age. He was, perhaps, 60, and his hair was fast whitening. He said, "For reasons of sanitation, it is not wise to breathe the breath of another." "Also," supplemented someone from the other side of that vast pit, "also, each is thereby enabled to surround himself with the electrical influences which suit him best." Smith stepped back, pondering. The doctor looked at the geologist to take his place, but Femme Ammon made way for Billy. At any other time she would have resented his "woman first" attitude. Now she quickly found voice. "How are you able to get along without aisles? It may seem a foolish question to you, but on Earth we would consider a hall without aisles about as convenient as a room without a door." Immediately a Venusian directly in front of her and on a level with her eyes called out, "Watch me, madam!" And quite without an effort beyond touching a button or two, the fellow rose straight into the air, glass and all, and then floated gently over toward the middle of the hall. "It probably appears complicated to you," explained the Venusian whose side he had just left. "We make use of elements not found on your Earth." Billy's sang-froid was not shaken. Instantly she came back energetically. "Apparently your method overcomes gravitation. Why haven't you tried to travel away from your planet?" And she looked around with the air of one who has uttered a poser only to have another of the satin-clad people reply from a point which she was not able to locate, "Because enough such power cannot be safely concentrated." As Billy retired, Van Emmon noted with growing irritation that the continuously affable aspect of the Venusians had not altered in any way, unless it was to become even more genial and sure. The big man strode energetically to the microphone, and the other three noted a general movement of interest and admiration as the people inspected him. "Why," demanded he, "do we see no signs of contention? If you are familiar with conditions on Earth, you surely know that rivalry, in one form or another, is the accepted basis of life. But all of you here appear to be perfectly happy, and at the same time entirely sure of yourself. We have just come from a planet where we have seen the principle of combat, of competition, carried so far that it seems to have wrecked a race. so you will pardon my curiosity, I am sure. From your faces one would conclude that you had abolished self-interest altogether. Just why are you so, well, extraordinary self-complacent?" And he thrust out his aggressive jaw as though to make up for the lack of chins about him. "Because there is nothing for us to combat, save within ourselves." This from a wide-faced chap in a bluish-white suit. "But surely you have rivalry of some sort?"
"No," another voice called. "Rivalry is the outgrowth of getting a livelihood. On earth it is inevitable, because men do the work. Here, everything is done by machines."
Still another put in. "Discontent is the mother of ambition, but we are all content, because each possesses all he desires." But the geologist was far from satisfied. "Then," said he vigorously, "if you have eliminated all contention, you have nullified the great law of contrasts. You say you are all rich. How do you know, if you have no poverty to contrast it with? On earth we appreciate warmth because we have experienced cold, pleasure because we know pain, happiness because we have always had misery with us. If we have not had the one we cannot value the other. If you have never been discontented, how do you know that you are content?" End of section 20. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway, the 18th of February, 2012. Section 21 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine G. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 8. The Keynote. For a minute or two it looked as though Van Emmon had raised an unanswerable question. There was no immediate reply. Even Estra looked around, as though in wonder at the silence, and seemed on the point of answering of his own accord, when a voice came from a man far up on the left. He said: "A little explanation may be wise. To begin with, you will agree that black is black because white is white, but it doesn't follow that blue is blue because green is green, or red is red. Blue is blue because it is neither green nor red nor any other color. It is blue, not because it contrasts with these other colors, but because it merely differs from them. Now, we on Venus do not need poverty in order to appreciate wealth. Instead, each of us is blessed with his own particular choice of wealth. Each is blessed in a different way, some with children, some with intellect, some with other matters, and the question of mere quantity never enters." "We do not need pain or misery," spoke up someone else, "any more than you people on the earth require an additional color in order to appreciate the variety you already have." And then from a Venusian with an especially strong voice: "That we are really content we know absolutely, for each of us, in his own distinctive way, is wholly and peculiarly satisfied." And it only added to the geologist's irritation to have these striking statements made in good-humored, impersonal fashion, which totally disarmed all opposition. That the Venusians were perfectly sure of their ground was undeniable, but they had such a cheerful way of looking at it, as though they didn't care a rap whether Van Emmon agreed or not, that, if they'd only have shown some spirit, Van Emmon would have liked it infinitely better if one of them had only become hot about it. At this point Estra rose in his chair. "I think you had best approach us from a fresh viewpoint," said he in his unfailingly agreeable manner. The doctor nodded vigorously, and again Estra closed his eyes in that odd, hesitating way. Immediately everyone in the place, with the exception of a single person in the lowest row, took flight in his or her glass pew. In a moment the great vault overhead was fairly swarming with people, and in less than a minute the last of them had floated out through one of the arches in the walls. Estra opened a panel in the central cage and admitted the Venusian who had stayed behind. She, for it appeared to be a young woman, walked with about the same facility as Estra, but as soon as she had entered the space, took the seat Estra had vacated, and waited. The action rather disappointed the doctor. He removed the interpreting telephone from his head, and asked, "I rather thought we were going to meet one of your officials, Estra. We'd have to go back home without having met your president, or whatever you call your chief executive." The two Venusians exchanged smiles, and to the surprise of the explorers, the woman gave the reply in a language as good as Estra's, but an even sweeter expression. "There is no such thing as a chief executive on Venus, friends." "I meant," explained the doctor, rattled, "the chairman of your cabinet, or council, or whatever it is that regulates your affairs. Perhaps," with an inspiration, "I should have said, the speaker of your congress." The Venusian shook her head, still smiling. She hesitated while selecting the best words, and the four noted that, while her features were quite as delicate as Estra's, her face was proportionately larger, and her whole figure better filled out. No one would have said that she was pretty, much less beautiful, but none would deny that she was very good looking, in a wholesome, intelligent, capable sort of way. Her name, Estra told them later, was Murin, and he explained that he and she were associated solely because of their mutual interest in the same planet, the Earth. Said Murin, "You are accustomed to the idea of government. We, however, have outgrown it. If you stop to think, you will agree that the purpose of government is to maintain peace on the one hand and to wage war on the other. Now, as to war, we haven't even separate nations any more. So we have no wars. And as for internal conflict, why should we ever quarrel when each of us is assured all that he can possibly want?" "So you have abolished government?" "A very long time ago. You on the earth will do the same, as soon as your people have been educated up to the point of trusting each other." "You haven't even a congress, then?" Miriam shook her head. "All questions such as a congress would deal with were settled ages ago. You must remember that the material features of our civilization have not changed for thousands of generations. The only questions that come up now are purely personal ones, which each must settle for himself." Van Emmen, as before, was not at all satisfied. "You say that machinery does your work for you. I presume you do not mean that literally. There must be some duties which cannot be performed without human direction at least. How do you get these duties accomplished, if you have no government to compel your people to do them?" Murin looked at a loss, either for the answer itself or for the most suitable words. Estra gave the reply. "Every device we possess is absolutely automatic. There is not one item in the materials we use but that was constructed, exactly as you see it now, many thousand years ago." Smith was incredulous. "Do you mean to say that those little glass pews have been in use all that time?" Estra nodded, smiling gently at the engineer's amazement. "Like everything else, they were built to last. You must remember that we do not have anything like an investment here. We do not have to consider the question of getting our capital back. So if any further improvements were to be made, they also would be done in a permanent fashion." Billy gave an exclamation of bewilderment. "I don't understand. You say that nothing new has been built, or even replaced, for centuries. How do you take care of your increasing population?" Thinking of the great crowd that had just left. Miriam was the one who answered this. As she did so, she got slowly to her feet, and speaking with the utmost care, watched to be sure that the four understood her. "Ever since the roof was put on, our increase of population has been exactly balanced by our death rate." The four followed their guides in silence as they led the way to the plaza. Now the space was alive with Venusians. The little cage were everywhere floating about in the air. Some of the people were laboriously shifting themselves into the aircraft. Others were guiding their pews directly to nearby houses. The visitors got plenty of curious stares from these quiet miracle workers, who seemed vastly more at home in the air than on the ground. "As thick as flies," Van Emmon commented. Estra and Mirren, walking very slowly, took them to a side street, where two of the cigar-shaped cars were standing. Billy and Smith got in with Estra, while Van Emmon and the doctor were giving seats beside the Venusian woman. The two cars were connected by a telephone, so that in effect the two parties were one. By this time the visitors had become so accustomed to the transparent material that they felt no uneasiness as the ground receded below them. Smith especially was tremendously impressed with Estra's declaration that the glass was, except for appearance, nothing more nor less than an extremely strong steel alloy. Propelled by the unexplained forces which the two drivers controlled by means of buttons in black cases, the two cars began to thread their way through the great roof columns. And as they proceeded, the four grew more and more amazed at the great extent of the city. For miles upon miles, that heterogeneous collection of buildings stretched, unbroken and within system, until the eye tired of trying to make out the limits of it. "What is the name of this city?" asked Billy, secretly hoping that it might bear some resemblance to New York. It struck her fancy to assume that this supermetropolis represented what Gotham, in time, might become. Estra did not take his attention from what he was doing, but answered as readily as ever. "I do not blame you for mistaking this for a city. The fact is, however, that we have no such thing." Billy stared at him helplessly. "You've abolished cities too?" "Not exactly. In the same sense that we have abolished nations, yes. Likewise we have abolished states, also counties. Neither have we such a thing as the country now. My friends, Venus is simply one immense city." End of section 21. Recording by Christine G. in Oslo, Norway. The 3rd of April, 2012.
Section 22 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 9. The Survival of All. Somehow all four were unwilling to press this question. It did not seem possible that Estra was right, or if he was, that they could possibly understand his explanation should he give it. The cars flew side by side for perhaps 100 miles, while the visitors put in the time in examining the landscape with the never-ending interest of all aeronauts. Here and there, in that closely packed surface, a particularly large building was to be noted every half mile or so. "Factories?" asked Billy of Estra, but he shook his head. "I'll show you factories later on," said he. "What you see are schools." But most observers would have considered the structures severely plain for their purpose. After a long silence, "I am still looking for streams," said Van Emmon to Myron. "Are your rivers as large as ours?" "We have no rivers," was the calm reply. "Rivers are entirely too wasteful of water. All our drainage is carried off through underground canals." "You haven't done away with your oceans, too, have you?" the geologist asked, rather sarcastically. But he was scarcely prepared for the reply he got. "No, we couldn't get along without them, I am afraid. However, we did the best we could in their case." And without signaling to Estra, she dove the machine towards the ground. Smith looked for the telephone wires to snap, but Estra seemed to know, and instantly followed Myron's lead. The doctor noticed and wondered all the more. And then came another surprise. As the machines neared the surface, a familiar odor floated in through the open windows of the aircraft, and the four found themselves looking at each other for signs of irrationality. A moment, and they saw that they were not mistaken. For although that kaleidoscopic expanse of buildings showed not the slightest break, yet they were now located on the sea. The houses were packed as closely together as anywhere. Apparently all were floating, yet not 10 square yards of open sea could be seen in any one spot. Van Emmon almost forgot his resentment in his growing wonder. "That gets me, Myron. Those houses seem to be merely floating, yet I see no motion whatever. Why are there no waves?" The doctor snorted. "Shame on you, Van. Don't let our friends think you are an absolute ignoramus," he added. "Venus has no moon and no wind, at least under the roof. Therefore no waves." Smith put in, "That being the case, there's no chance to start a wave motor industry here. Neither," as he thought further, "neither for water power. Having no rain in your mountains, Estra, where do you get your power?" But it was Myron who answered. "I suppose you are all familiar with radium. It is nothing more or less than condensed sunlight, which in turn is simply electromagnetic waves, although it may take your scientists a good many centuries to reach that conclusion. Well, every particle of the material which composes this planet contains radioactivity of some sort, and we long ago discovered a way to release it and use it. 1 pound of solid granite yields enough energy to, well, a great deal of power." They had now been flying for 2 hours, and still no end to the thickly housed, ever different appearance of the ground. Also, although they saw a great many birds, they noted no animals. Finally Billie could hold in no longer. "Are we to understand," she demanded of Estra, "that the whole of this planet is as densely populated as we see it?" "Just that," replied the Venusian. "Why not? The roof makes our climate uniform from pole to pole, while our buildings are such that, whether on land or on sea, they are equally livable." "But, Estra," expostulated the girl, "Venus is nearly as big as the Earth, and it looks to be as thickly populated as Rhode Island. Why, you must have a colossal population. Let me see." And she scribbled away in her memorandum book. But both Smith and the doctor had already worked it out. They looked up, blinking dazedly. "Over 300 billion," murmured the doctor, as though dizzy. The Venusian checked Smith's correction with, "You dropped one cipher, doctor. There are 3.5 trillion of us." "Good Lord!" whispered Van Emmon, all his antagonism gone for the moment, and again the explorers were silent for a long time. By and by, however, "We have just seen what it meant there on Mercury," said the doctor in a low voice, "for the principle of the survival of the fit to be carried to its logical end. For who is to decide what is fitness save the fittest? One man apparently outlived everyone else on the planet, and then he also died. But here you have gone the limit in the other direction. Of course, we might have known that you long ago abolished poverty, unearned wealth, pestilence, drunkenness, and the other causes of premature death. But as for 3.5 trillion—" "Nevertheless," remarked Myron, "every last one of us, once born, lives to die of old age, and in most cases this means several hundred of your years." Smith involuntarily rubbed his eyes, and they all laughed, a nervous sort of a laugh, which left the visitors still in doubt as to their senses and their guide's sanity. Van Emmon's suspicions came back with a rush, and he burst out: "Say, you'll excuse me, but I can't swallow this. Here you've shown us houses as thick as leaves, not a sign of a farm, much less an orchard, no vegetation at all, except for a few flowers. 3.5 trillion! All right, let it go at that." Out came his chin, and he brought one fist down upon the other as though he were cracking rocks with a hammer, and with every blow he uttered a word: "How do you feed them all?" End of Section 22. Section 23 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part IV. The Queen of Life. Chapter 10. Loaves and Fishes. Without a word, Myron drove her machine toward the ground, and as before, Estra followed, despite the lack of any visible signal. Within a minute the two machines had come to rest, softly and without disturbance, on the roof of a handsome building, much like an apartment house. There was the usual transparent elevator, and a minute later the four were being introduced to the occupants of a typical Venusian house. These two people, apparently man and wife, did not need to be told why the explorers had been brought there. They led the way from the dimly lighted hallway in which the elevator had stopped, into a group of brightly decorated rooms. Here the four were given seats in the usual saddle-like chairs, and then Myron answered Van Emmon's question. I knew that this point would arise soon, and you will pardon me if I handle it in a prearranged fashion. I will admit that it is not an easy question Mr. Van Emmon has put, not because the answer is at all complicated, but on the contrary extremely simple. The four were listening unanimously. Despite himself, Van Emmon was highly impressed by the Venusian woman's serious manner. Perhaps it was because in her earnestness she was not quite so affable as before. She went on. From where you are sitting you can see all the rooms in this house. You will look in vain for anything even remotely resembling a kitchen. There is not even a dining room. And yet you must not jump to the conclusion that we all use restaurants. We have no such thing as a public eating place, or rather, and here she spoke very carefully, rather, every place is an eating place. The doctor looked Myron over as though she were a patient with a new kind of disease. "You do not mean that literally, of course," said he kindly. But she nodded gravely. "You must not misunderstand. Remember, even on your own planet, the distribution of food is becoming more and more extensive, until you can now buy something to eat at every crossroads. We have merely carried the idea to its logical end, so that all Venusians can obtain food at any time and at any spot." She turned in her chair. All the chairs on Venus were pivoted, Estra said, and touched a button in the wall at her hand. A panel slid noiselessly aside and revealed a tiny buffet. At least Billy labeled it a buffet for want of a more accurate term, for it consisted of a silver bib, something like the nozzle of a soda-water fountain, above which was a board containing a large number of tiny numbered push-buttons. Below the bib was a space in which a cup might be set, and projecting from a tube at one side was a solid block of telescoping transparent cups. "This," said Myron, "is the Venusian nutrition system. There is a station like this in every room on the planet." And she proceeded to take a cup from the tube, filling each from the silver faucet, while she pressed a variety of the buttons. The four watched in silence, and eagerly took what was given to them. It comprised liquids entirely, liquids of every degree of fluidity, from some as thin as water to others as thick as gruel. They varied even more as to colour, ranging from actual transparency to a deep chocolate. "Now, I warn you not to be shocked," said Myron, "although I fully expect that you will be. The fact is that we have no other kind of food than what you see. There are thousands upon thousands of different kinds and flavors, but they are all fluids. We have nothing whatever in solid form. You see," she explained, "we have no teeth." All they could do was stare at her. With a return of her smile, she made a sudden gesture across the front of her mouth. Next instant a set of false teeth lay in her hand. Estra spoke up. "We are both obliged to wear them in order that we might use your language." He removed his own to show a mouth as free of teeth as a newborn baby's. Both Venusians replaced their sets and smiled afresh at the explorer's astonishment. "Teeth will soon be a thing of the past with you on the Earth, too," commented Myron. "Dr. Kinney will surely testify to that. Your use of soft cooked foods instead of the coarse hard articles provided by nature is bound to have this effect in time. With us it resulted in having teeth reduced to the standing of your appendix, and, like you, we resort to an operation rather than take chances on trouble. I may mention that the appendix is totally absent from all Venusians, while we are beginning to lose all traces of either the first or second molars, just as you are beginning to lose your wisdom teeth. However, suppose you try our diet while I explain." The four once more looked at each other. The doctor was the first to take a sip of one of the cups handed to him, and Van Emmon was the last. The geologist waited to see the effects upon the others before gingerly tasting of the thickest, darkest liquid of them all. Another taste, and he discovered that it was very good, and that he was exceedingly hungry. "Very delicately flavoured," commented Billie, after emptying her fourth glass, a golden fluid with a slightly oily appearance. "Delicately is right," said the doctor. "This stuff is barely flavoured at all, Astra." The Venusian was also eating. "We much prefer them all that way," said he. "I suppose you would consider our tastes very finicky on Earth, but the fact is we are able to distinguish between minute variations in flavouring, such as would escape all on Earth except a humming bird." "I suppose," remarked the doctor, smacking his lips over a reddish solution with a wine like flavour, "I suppose we can expect something of that sort on the Earth too in time. Originally mankind was only able to distinguish fresh from stale and animal from vegetable flavours." After a while Myron went on: "You know the processes of nutrition as they take place among your people are extremely wasteful. You have probably heard it said that the average human is only 50% efficient. That simply means that digestion, assimilation, and excretion require half the energy which they secure from the food. Now, the articles you have just swallowed require very little work on the part of your digestive apparatus, and none at all upon your eliminating tract. The food is almost instantly transformed into fresh blood. If I am not mistaken, you already feel much refreshed." This was decidedly true. All four felt actually stimulated. Van Emmon instantly suspected the food of being alcoholic. As he continued to watch its effect, however, he saw that there was no harmful reaction as in the case of the notorious drug. "I think I can now tell you how we produce enough food for the 3.5 trillion of us, despite our lack of farms and orchards," said Myron, rising. Returning to the aircraft, the four were taken a short distance in a new direction, and again descended, this time transferring to an elevator which dropped far below the surface. They came to a stop about 10 floors down. "Naturally," said Myron, "we reserve all the surface for residence purposes, although it is possible to live down here in comparative comfort, since we have plenty of electrical energy to spare." And she operated a switch, flooding the place with a brilliant glow. Thrown from concealed sources, this light was quite as strong as the subdued daylight which they had just left. But unless we were free to fly about as much as we do, we should feel that life was a bore. Nobody stays below any longer than is necessary. Now this is where our food comes from." Whereupon she showed them a series of automatic machines, all working away there on the solid rock of the planet, and of such an extraordinary nature that Smith, the engineer, moved about in an atmosphere of supreme bliss. "You will understand," said Myron, "that the usual processes of nutrition on the earth depend entirely upon plant life. We, however, cannot spare room enough for any such system, so we had to devise substitutes for plants. In effect, that is what these machines are. They convert bedrock into loam, take the nitrates and other chemicals. [Footnote: The geology of Venus is thoroughly described in Mr. Van Emmon's report to the AMEA.] Directly from this artificial soil, and by a pseudo osmotic process, secure results similar to those produced by roots. Likewise we have developed artificial leaves," pointing out a huge apparatus which none but a highly trained expert in both botany and mechanics could have half understood. "This machine first manufactures chlorophyll. Yes, it does," as the doctor snorted incredulously, "not an imitation but real chlorophyll, and then transforms the various elements into starch, sugar, and proteids. through the agency of the sunlight recovered from the granite. In short, to answer your question, Mr. Van Emmon, as to how we are all fed, we do not grow our food at all. We go straight to the practically unlimited supply of raw materials under our feet, and manufacture our food outright. End of section 23. Section 24 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 11. The Super Ambition. Billy was very quiet during their return to the surface. She said nothing until they had reached the 2 cars, and then, pausing as she was about to step in, she said, "Well, I never saw our old friend, the high cost of living, handled quite so easily." "If that's the way you do things here, Estra," and the girl did not flinch at the gazes the others turned upon her, "if that's your way, it's good enough for me. I'm going to stay." For the first time Estra looked astonished. He and Myron exchanged lightning-like glances. Then the Venusian's face warmed with the smile he gave the architect. "It is very good of you to say that," he said impressively. "I was afraid some of our peculiarities might arouse very different feelings." They stared at one another for a second or two, long enough for the doctor to notice and to see how Van Emmon took it. The geologist, however, was smiling upon the girl in a big brotherly fashion, which indicated that he thought she didn't mean what she had said. Had he been looking up at her, however, instead of down upon her, he would have seen that her chin was most resolute. Just as they were about to start again, both Estra and Myron stopped short in their tracks, with that odd hesitation that had mystified the 4 all along, and after perhaps 5 seconds of silence, turned to one another with grave faces. It was Estra who explained. "It is curious how things do pile up," said he, a little conscious of having employed an idiom. "Our planet has gone along for hundreds of generations without anything especially remarkable happening, so that recently many prophets have foretold a number of startling events to take place on a single day, and this seems to have come true. You have been with us scarcely 10 hours," and the visitors stared at each other in amazement that so much time had passed. "Scarcely 10 hours, and here comes an announcement which, for over 100 years, has been looked forward to with—" He stopped abruptly. The doctor gently took him up. "Looked forward to with what, Astra?" Estra and Myron considered this for perhaps 3 seconds. It was the woman who replied. "The fact is, your approach to the planet has stimulated all sorts of research immensely. Matters that had been hanging fire indefinitely were revived. This is one of them. In that sense you are to blame." But she smiled as reassuringly as she could, allowing for a certain anxiety which had now come to her face. "Don't you think you could make it clear to us?" asked Billy, encouragingly. At the same time all 4 noticed that the air, which before had fairly thronged with machines, was now simply alive with them. People were flitting here and there like swarms of insects, and with as little apparent aim. Both Estra and Myron were extra watchful. Also they displayed a certain eagerness to get away, setting their course in still another direction. In a minute or 2 the congestion seemed relieved, and Myron began to talk slowly. "You have doubtless guessed by this time that we Venusians have crossed what some call the animal divide. We are predominantly intellectual, while you on Earth are, as a race, still predominantly animal. Excuse me for putting it so bluntly." "It's all right," said the doctor with an effort. "What you say is true of most of us," he added. "Most thinking people realize that when our civilization reaches the point where the getting of a living becomes secondary instead of primary, as at present, a great change is bound to come to the race." The Venusian nodded. "Under the conditions which now surround us, you can see we have vastly more time for what you would call spiritual matters, only we label them psychological experiences. In fact, the supernatural is the Venusian's daily business." There was another pause, during which both Venusians, driving at high speed though they were, once more closed their eyes for a second or so. Estra evidently thought it time to explain. "For instance, telepathy. With us it takes the place of wireless, for we have developed the power to such a point that any Venusian can call up any other, no matter where either may be. That is why we need no signs or addresses. There are certain restrictions. For instance, no one can read another's thoughts without his permission. Of course, we still have speech. Speech and language are the ABCs of the Venusian, and we still keep the telephone, for the sake of checking up now and then. Just now we are driving for my own house, where there is apparatus which will enable you to both hear and understand an announcement which is shortly to be made." There was something decidedly satisfying, especially to Van Emmon, in being taken into the Venusian confidence to this extent. When he put his question, it was with his former aggressiveness much modified. He said: "I should think that your people have pretty well exhausted the possibilities of the supernatural by this time. Progress having come to an end, I don't see what you find to interest you, Myron." "The fact is," Billy put in, "we feel somewhat disappointed that your people have shown so little interest in us," and she gave a sidelong glance at Estra, who returned the look with a direct, smiling gaze which sent a flood of color into the architect's face. "Look out!" sharply from Van Emmon, and with barely an inch to spare, Estra steered his car past another which he had nearly overlooked. For another minute or two there was silence. Then Myron said: "You wonder what there is to interest us, and yet every time you look up at the stars the answer is before your eyes. You see, although we cannot read your thoughts without your permission, yet you on the earth cannot prevent us from overhearing anything that may be said. Under proper conditions, our psychic senses are delicate enough to feel the slightest whisper on earth. That is why Estra and I are able to use your language. We have learnt it together with an understanding of your lives and customs by simply listening in. I may add that we are also able to use your eyes. We knew directly what you people looked like before you arrived. Well, it is our ambition to visit in spirit every planet in the universe. There are hundreds of millions of stars. Every one is a sun, and each has planets. 1 in 100 contains life, some very elementary, others much more advanced than we are. So far, we have been able to study nearly 2,000 worlds besides those in this solar system. Do you still think, friend, we have nothing to interest us?" She raised a hand in a gesture of emphasis, and it was then that Billy, her eyes on Myron's fingers, saw another sign of the great advancement these people had made, direct proof, in fact, of what Myron had just claimed. For there must have been a tremendous gain in the intellect to have caused such a drain upon the body as Billy saw. In no other way could it be explained. The minds of the Venusian had grown at a fearful cost to flesh and blood. Not only were the fingernails entirely lacking from Myron's hands, but the lower joints of her 4 fingers, from the palm to the knuckles, were grown smoothly together. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 12. The Mental Limit. "Make yourselves at home," said Estra as they stepped into his apartment. The cars just filled his balcony. "This is my workshop. See if you can guess my occupation from what you see. As for Myron and myself, we must make certain preparations before the announcement is made." They disappeared, and the 4 inspected the place. As in the other house they had entered, the room was provided with a double row of small windows, some being down near the floor, and the others level with the eyes. These, in addition to 2 doors, all of which were of translucent material. On low benches about the room were a number of instruments, some of which looked familiar to the doctor. He said he had seen something much like them in psychology class during his college days. For the most part their appearance defied ordinary description. [Footnote: Physicians, biologists, and others interested in matters of this nature will find the above fully treated in Dr. Kinney's reports to the AMA. End of footnote. But one piece of apparatus was given such prominence that it is worth detailing. It consisted of a hollow, cube-shaped metal framework, about a foot in either direction, upon which was mounted about 40 long thumb-screws, all pointing towards the inside of the frame. The inner ends of the screws were provided with small silver pads, while the outer ends were so connected, each with a tiny dial, as to register the amount of motion of the screw. Smith turned one of them in and out, and said it reminded him of a micrometer gauge. Then Billy noted that the entire device was so placed upon the bench as to set directly over a hole about 10 inches in diameter. And under the bench was one of the saddle-like chairs. The architect's antiquarian lore came back to her with a rush, and she remembered something she had seen in a museum, a relic of the Inquisition. "Good heavens!" she whispered. "What is this? An instrument of torture?" It certainly looked mightily like one of the head-crushing devices Billy had seen. Thumb-screws and all, this appeared to be only a very elaborate persuader for use upon those who must be made to talk. But the doctor was thinking hard. A big light flashed into his eyes. "This," he declared positively, "is something that will become a matter of course in our own educational system, as soon as the science of phrenology is better understood." And next second he had ducked under the bench and thrust his head through the round hole, so that his skull was brought into contact with some of those padded thumb-screws. "Get the idea?" he finished. "It's a cranium meter." It did not take Smith long to reach the next conclusion. "Then," said he, "our friend Estra is connected with their school system. Can't say what he would be called, but I should say his function is to measure the capacity of students for various kinds of knowledge, in order that their education may be adapted accordingly. Might call him a brain surveyor," he concluded. "Or a noodle-smith," added the geologist deprecatingly. "Rather a career appraiser," indignantly from Billy. "People look to him to suggest what they should take up and what they should leave alone. Why, he's one of the most important men on this whole planet." And again the doctor was a witness to a clash of eyes between the girl and the geologist. Van Emmon said nothing further, however, but turned to examine an immense bookcase on the other side of the room. This case had shelves scarcely 2 inches apart, and about half as deep, and held perhaps 500,000 extremely small books. Each comprised many hundreds of pages, made of a perfectly opaque, bluish-white material of such incredible thinness that ordinary India paper resembled cardboard by comparison. They were printed much the same as any other book, except that the characters were of microscopic size, and the lines extremely close together. Also in some of the books these lines were black and red, alternatingly. Billy eagerly examined one of the diminutive volumes under a strong glass, and pronounced the black printed characters not unlike ancient Gothic type. She guessed that the language was synthetic, like Roman or Esperanto, and that the alphabet numbered 60 or 70. "The red lines," she added not so confidently, "are in a different language. Looks wonderfully like Persian." By this time the others were doing the same as she, and marveling to note that, wherever the red and black lines were employed, invariably the black were in the same language, while the red characters were totally different in each book. Suddenly Smith gave a start so vigorously that the other turned in alarm. He was holding one of the books as though it were white hot. "Look!" he stuttered excitedly. "Just look at it!" And no wonder. In the book he had chanced to pick up, the red lines were printed in English. "Talk about your finds!" exclaimed Billy, in an awe-struck tone. "Why, this library is a literal translation of the languages of—" She fairly gasped as she recalled Myron's words, "thousands of planets." After that she fell silent. Plainly, the discovery had profoundly affected and strengthened her notion of remaining on the planet. Van Emmon, watching her narrowly, saw her give the room an appraising glance, which meant, plain as day, "I'd like to keep this place in spick and span condition." and another not so easy to interpret. "I'd like to show these people a thing or two about designing houses." And the geologist's heart sank for an instant. He turned resolutely to the bookcase, and shortly found something which he showed to the doctor. It was a book printed all in Venusian. They carefully translated the title page, using one of the interlinear English books as a guide, and saw that it was a complete text book on astral development. "With these instructions," the doctor declared, "anyone could do as the Venusians do, visit other worlds in spirit." Just then Estra and Myron returned. They were moving at what was for them a rapid pace, and to all appearances they were rather excited. "We were not able to make these records as perfect as we would like," said Estra, holding up 4 discs similar to the ones which still lay in the explorers' translating machines. He proceeded to open the little black cases and make the exchange. "There will be words used which I did not see fit to incorporate in the original vocabulary, but which you will have to understand perfectly if this announcement is to mean anything to you." "Thank you," said the doctor quietly. "And now don't you think we had best know in advance just what is to be the subject of—" "Hush!" whispered Estra, and next second they were listening to the telephone in amazement. End of Section 25. Recording by Amy Graymore. www.amysmindtoyourmind.com.
Section 26 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Richards. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Chapter 13. The War of the Sexes. "In accordance with my promise," stated a high-pitched, effeminate voice, "I am going to demonstrate a juvenation method upon which I have worked for the past 122 years. There was a brief pause, during which Ethra hurriedly explained that the man who was making the speech was located far on the other side of the planet, in a hall like the one the 4 had first visited, and that he was making the demonstration before a great gathering of scientists. "Too bad you cannot see as we do," commented the Venusian. "However, Savarona may go into the details of—" "If the committee men are entirely finished with their measurements," stated the unseen experimenter, "I would like to have the results compared with the recorded figures of Perio Caminal, who was born on the 215th day of the year 21,704. Another rest, and Ethra said, "They are examining a boy who appears to be about 12 years of age." Then came other voices. "As we all know, the craniums of all are absolutely distinct, as much so as our fingerprints. The measurements correspond identically with those of Perio Caminal, beyond a doubt. This boy can be none other than Pario. Then," the high-pitched voice went on, "then notice the formula I have written on this blackboard. Using this solution, I have supplied nourishment to this lad from the hour of his birth until a few days ago. I was not satisfied with the results. The patient showed a tiny variation from the allowable subconscious maximum, together with only 9/10 the required motor reaction. But I have corrected this. Briefly, I have incorporated in Perio Caminal's standard diet certain elements which have hitherto been unsafe to combine. These elements are derivatives of the potash group, for the most part, together with phosphates which need a new classification. Their effect," impressively, "has been to postpone age indefinitely." There must have been tremendous sensation in that hall. The speaker's voice shook with excitement as he went on. "We have sought in vain, friends, for a way to cheat death of his due. We have succeeded in postponing his advent until our average longevity is several times greater than our neighboring planet, but so far it has been a mere reprieve. What I have done is to prevent age itself. This lad is 122 years old, mentally, and still only 12 years old as to body. In short, I offer you the fountain of youth itself." The speaker paused. There was no comment. Evidently all had been as greatly impressed as the explorers. Then the voice of the man Savaronah finished, very deliberately. "I regret to say that my treatment, despite all that I have been able to do, cannot be adapted to the female constitution. It would be fatal to any but males. I repeat, I can offer eternal youth, absolutely, but only to the newborn males." This time there was a definite response. From the telephone came a confused murmuring, at which Von Emmon's face lighted up with delight. The murmuring had an angry sound. "This is outrageous!" A loud contralto voice was raised above the rest. "You are unethical, Savaronah, to announce such a thing before adapting it to both sexes." The high-pitched voice replied shortly, and with much more than a hint of malice. "If a woman had discovered this, instead of me, I dare say you would have no objections." The murmuring grew louder, angrier, more confused. The four from the earth looked at each other in some slight uneasiness. At the same time they noted that Ethra, his eyes tightly closed and his fists clenched in the intensity of his concentration, suddenly gave a sigh of relief. Next second he began to speak into the telephone, in a voice so loud as to silence all the clamor. "Savaronah and the people of Venus, listen! The prophets were right when they said today would witness many great things. I have just learned of another experiment which transcends even that of Savaronah." An instant's pause, then. "First, let me remind you that we have been doing all we could to elevate our spiritual selves. We are daily trying to eliminate all that is animal, all that is gross and demeaning in us, even to the extent of reducing the flavors of our foods to the lowest tolerable point. And despite all this, we have not been able to get rid of sex jealousy. We still have the beast within us. No matter how pure our love may be, it is always tainted with rivalry. Always the husband and wife are held down by this mutual envy, forever dragging at their heels, constantly holding them back from the lofty heights of spiritual power to which they aspire." He paused, and Savaronah's voice broke in triumphantly. "You are right, Ethra. You are right, except you did not mention that this jealousy becomes less and less as one grows older. Now my discovery will put an end to your beast, Ethra. My experiments took this lad before he had become a man, and allowed his brain to develop, while his body stopped growing. He is a man in mentality, and an innocent boy in body. Ethra, I have done the thing you wish. This boy will never know jealousy, because he will never know love." The man in the room with the four answered in a flash. "So you have, Savaronah, but only for men. No female can benefit by what you have done." "But I tell you that, within the past few minutes, a child has been born under circumstances which can be repeated at any time and for any sex. In this case," the Venusian voice changed curiously, "in this case, however, it was a girl, for the mother controlled the sex in the customary manner." At this the doctor's interest became acute. At the same time the other three felt a tremendous, inexplicable thrill. "Friends," and Ethra's face shone in his enthusiasm, "friends, for the first time in creation, the human male germ has been dispensed with. The intellect has done what the laboratory could not do. I have the honor to announce that my sister, Amra, has just given birth," his voice fairly rang, "has just given birth to a girl baby, whose only father was her mother's brain." End of section 26. End of chapter 13. Recording by Paul Richards.
Section 27 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniela Austin. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 14. Estra. This time there was no drowning the confusion. The telephone fairly shook with innumerable cries, shouts, imprecations. The four gave up trying to hear, and watched the two Venusians. Myron was facing Estra now. Her expression had lost a great deal of its good humor, and there was a certain sharpness in her voice as she exclaimed, "Estra, if your sister has done this, and I see no reason to doubt it, then she has made man superfluous. If women can produce children mechanically, and govern the sex at will, the coming race need be nothing but females." Estra nodded gravely. "This is what it amounts to, Myron." For a moment the two stared at one another challengingly. On the earth their attitude would have indicated some unimportant tiff. None would have dreamed that the most momentous question in their lives had come up, and had found them at outs. Next instant Myron turned, and without another word walked from the room. Estra followed slowly to the door, where he stood looking after her with an expression of the keenest concern on his sensitive, high-strung features. The three men from the earth, after a glance, studiously avoided looking at him. But Billy walked up and laid a hand on his arm. "Are you really in favor of this scheme?" she inquired in a curiously tender voice. At the same time she gazed intently into Estra's eyes. He turned, and the smile came back to his face. He took Billy's hand and laid it between both his own. His voice was even gentler than before. "Most certainly I do favor my sister's method, Billy. It will be the greatest boon the race has ever known. We can look forward now," and his face shone again, "can look forward to generation upon generation of people whose spirituality will be absolute." The girl moved closer to him. She spoke with feverish earnestness. "There may be some hitch in the idea, Estra. If God meant for man to become obsolete, he would not have hidden the method all this time. Suppose some flaw should develop later on." In the cube, Billy Jackson would not have stumbled over such a speech. She would have ignored the fact that Estra was holding her hand all this time and gazing deep into her eyes. She would have been filled with what she was saying and not with what she was seeing. On the other side of the room, Van Emmon watched and glowered. He could not hear. The Venusian lifted his head suddenly. The voices from the telephone had subsided. Only an occasional outburst came from the instrument. Estra closed his eyes again for a second, and when he opened them again his manner was astonishingly alert, and his speech swift and to the point. "So far as we know, Billy, the method has no flaws. It gives us the chance to throw off our lower selves, and if by so doing we reduce the race to a single sex, only—" He stopped short, as though at a sound, and with a word of apology stepped from the room. He opened another door, far down the corridor, and as he passed through, the wail of a newborn infant came faintly to the fore. "Wonder what's up," said Smith. Van Emmon, who had gone to the window, whirled upon the engineer and motioned him to his side. "Look at the people!" Smith saw that the nearby houses were almost concealed by a throng which had gathered, silently and without confusion, during the past few minutes. Their numbers were increasing swiftly, fresh arrivals packing the background. People filled the streets. The space below Estra's balcony was already crowded as closely as it could be. Except for a low-voiced buzzing, there was no disturbance. Billy came up. She seemed to divine the temper of the mob. She caught her breath sharply and then said very simply, "It reminds me of Bethlehem." But the words had scarcely left her mouth before an uproar sounded from one end of the street below. A crowd of excited Venusians was pushing its way determinedly toward the house, their passage obstructed by shouting, protesting individuals. Van Emmon's breast began to heave. He fancied he saw blows struck. "By George!" he exclaimed next second. "They're fighting!" It was true. A hand-to-hand battle was going on less than a block away. The people below the window surged in the direction of the fight. All were shouting now. The clamor was deafening. "Live and let live!" came one of the shouts. It was taken up by the group that was doing the attacking, and made into a cheer. Then came other cries from them. Smith made out something like, "Down with sex monopoly!" "Don't you see?" shouted Smith above the din. These people below are Estra's friends. Those newcomers are backing Savarona. Get the idea?" He repeated. "If Estra wins out, the old boy with the Fountain of Youth will never get another boy baby to experiment on." "What?" The doctor leaped to their sides. He took it in at a glance, then whirled to the door. "We ought to warn Estra." "He knows it already," reminded Billy swiftly. A great shout came from below. The attackers had forced their way through the crowd of Estra's friends. "Well," Van Emmon stood squarely in the middle of the room. "So far as I'm concerned, Estra and his sister can face that crowd alone. I don't approve of the scheme." The doctor eyed him thoughtfully. "I'm not so sure, Van. This is a tremendous thing. We ought to—" "Van is right!" exploded Billy. Her voice rose to a shriek as a crash shook the house. Next instant Mirren, for once in a hurry, broke into the room. She glanced about, missed Estra, looked slightly puzzled, and then frowned angrily as the Venusian himself stepped in. "You fooled me," she shot at him, but he smiled apologetically. He was carrying a large package of leaflets, closely printed in Venusian. There seemed to be several thousand in the lot. He said, by way of explanation, "I had to get ready. Savarona's people will be here any moment. They have destroyed the elevator and—" A wave of clamor burst from below. "They've broken the barrier," remarked Estra calmly. He turned to the door, then whirled at a crash which sounded from above. "Through the roof," he added. He did not even glance at the balcony, where the two cars barred the way against any attack from that direction. Next second he again quit the room. Myron hesitated a moment, irresolute, and then followed him thoughtfully. They never saw her again. As for Estra, he came back in a moment carrying a small white bundle, which stirred in his arms. He unhesitatingly handed the child to Billy. His mouth moved soundlessly as a muffled shriek arose from the other end of the corridor. There was a thud, a metallic crash, and a great roar of voices. The mob had broken in and up through the back of the house. The first of the attackers thrust his head and shoulders into sight, not 10 feet away. Estra touched something with his foot, and a door shot across the corridor. There was an instant's silence, then the thunder of the mob, hurling itself against the door. The people were fairly snarling now. Estra closed the inner door. "Estra!" shrilly from Billy. She laid the baby down and strode to the Venusian. "Let's get out of here. The car's on the balcony. Nobody's in the way to interfere." "Why not—" A grinding, ripping jar from above, and Estra shook his head. The smile was gone, and his mouth was set and grim. "They'd catch us before we went a mile," he said, glancing at the infant, who had begun to cry in a stifled, gasping way that tore at the nerves. "Estra!" Billy pleaded, but he turned away. The doctor strode up to him and gripped his shoulder. "What's the good, Estra? What can you accomplish? Even if you—" The Venusian tapped his forehead. "I can tell," he exclaimed, with a return of the exalted flush. "Just give me a chance to offer my sister's discovery to the world, and I shall be satisfied." He touched the package of leaflets. "These are not written as clearly as they should be. But if I cannot hold them back, then these," fingering the papers, "these go to the friends down below." He moved closer to the window, but his eyes were on the door. A rending crash told that the corridor was now open to the mob. There was a rush, and then the storm of the people battering the last door. "Van! Doc! Billy!" Smith had the window open and was stepping into one of the cars. Kinney and the geologist were at his side in an instant. The girl held back. "Estra!" she begged. She picked up the baby, and with her free hand tugged at the Venusian's arm. "Come on! Don't sacrifice yourself!" The door bulged under the attack. The noise was ear-splitting. Nevertheless, Estra heard, and shook his head without looking at the woman from the earth. She dashed to the window, then came back. "Hurry! There's a chance!" He stood unmoved, watchful, and ready. "Estra, I want you to come!" Her face flamed. Can't you see that I want you?" She gasped as the door shrieked under the strain. "Come, if you're a man!" The Venusian's face changed. He turned and stared at the girl with eyes that held nothing but blank amazement. The grimness left his mouth. His lips partly opened. He took a step forward and threw an arm about her shoulders. "Billy, I'm sorry. I never thought—" A crack showed at the edge of the door. and a roar smote their ears. Esther backed to the window. "Go," he shouted. "Go quickly while you can." Billy stood stock still, gazing at him. "I'm going to stay," she screamed. "I'll take my chances with—" He thrust her through the window. "You don't understand," he shouted, and took the baby away from her despite all her strength. Then a wonderfully tender light came into his eyes. He gripped Billy's hands and spoke sorrowfully. "Billy, I'm not what you thought. I'm not a man. I'm a woman." End of section 27. Recording by Daniela Austin.
Section 28 of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life by Homer Eon Flint. Part 4. The Queen of Life. Chapter 15. Back. By the time Smith had driven the strange craft 50 yards, he had it under control. Billy glanced back. Estra was out on the balcony now, and the mob was surging against the windows she had locked against them. She shifted the baby to the hollow of one arm, while with the other she broke the cord of the packet. At the sight, the crowd in the street gave voice. "Let us have it!" they were crying. They drowned out the uproar within the house. Estra did not even look at the other car. Then the windows gave way. Like the breaking of a dam, a flood of Venusians poured and tumbled at Estra's feet. She raised her hand and shouted something Billy could not hear. Then, scarcely without pause, the crowd bore down upon her. And even as she was crushed against the railing, with one hand she dropped the baby to eager upstretched arms below, and with the other she tossed the package high in the air. There it broke apart. The air caught it, and the thousands of leaflets fluttered down upon that street full of sympathizers. Leaflets, each of which described a discovery which was to give to women the power of abolishing the opposite sex, of making Venus a world not only one in country, one in industry, and one in thought, but one in sex. The thunderous meaning of Estra's last action almost made Billy forget that it was, in truth, the woman's last act. For next moment her lifeless form was being crushed beneath the feet of that supremely cultured, marvelously civilized mob. For it was only a mob, despite its astounding advancement, a mob which had retained all the brute's fanaticism and all the male jealousy of the female. For they were all men. The four had been on Venus almost 24 hours, when Smith, knowing the condition of the machinery in the cube, warned the others that they must return. Secretly he was tired of the Venusians' continual smiling, for they had fairly outdone each other to show the visitors all that could be shown. But it was Van Emmon who thought to ask for Estra's wonderful library. "These chemicals and metals you are giving us," he said, making a regular speech of it, "are extremely welcome. They will enable us to perform experiments otherwise out of our reach. But Estra's books will mean still more to the people of the earth. If there is no one else with more need for them, who is going to put in a claim, then why not let us have them?" Apparently the Venusians did not like the idea very well. "They must have thought it was like letting a monkey play with a rifle," the doctor afterward put it. But for lack of a leader with any motive for objecting, and because Estra had no living relatives to claim the library, somehow that incredible collection of intellectual gems got into the possession of the four. Nothing was said about it during the quiet leave-taking, and when the cube finally rose away from the roof, Van Emmon's face beamed with happiness, and a great sigh of satisfaction escaped him. "Well," looking at the books, "they kind of make up for the fact that the folks didn't ask us to call again." And he turned and went straight to the kitchenette, where he proceeded with great speed and efficiency to set out the following: canned soup, canned baked beans, fried bacon and egg, coffee, peaches. "Come and get it," he shouted. The doctor tore himself away from the books. Smith crawled out from the beloved machines. Billy came shortly from her cubbyhole and slipped into her seat in a highly excited manner. There was a brightness in her cheeks, and a noticeable change in her usual assured manner. This timidity, so utterly new to the girl, seemed most pronounced whenever Van Emmon chanced to look at her, which was quite often. All four were ravenous. They had been away from the cube a day and a night, and all we had to eat was something to drink, as Smith complained. Nothing whatever was said except, "Please pass that," and "Thanks," for fully 15 minutes. At last they were satisfied. The doctor went back to the books. Smith returned to his oil can and wrench. But Billy stood by the table and began helping Van Emmon to clear up. In a moment they were face to face. "Van," she said softly, and looked up at him wistfully. "Van, do you like me better this way?" Her eyes were almost piteous. Into the man's face there came a look of amazement, followed by one of admiration, and another of genuine delight. He gave a little laugh, and unconsciously threw out his hands. "Much better, Billy." Neither of them cared a particle whether Smith or the doctor saw that Billy, very simply and naturally, walked right into Van Emmon's arms. "Much better. Besides, you're really too graceful to wear anything else." End of Section 28. End of The Lord of Death and the Queen of Life, by Homer Eon Flint.